Well, good morning. Today we just read 2 Corinthians chapter 12, and we hear Paul discussing some pretty amazing things. And in addressing the church there at Corinth and addressing some of his opponents there, he qualifies himself in the work of the gospel by telling them a little bit about what God had shown him through visions and revelations. He had been given a glimpse behind God's curtain and had heard and seen things too wonderful for one man to explain. And he had reasons to boast about this, and he could boast further about what God had been using him to do and shown him. But he stopped short of bragging too much so that no one would put him on a pedestal unnecessarily. Then in verse 7, he states, "To keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given to me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited." Wow. The nature of this thorn is one that has been discussed and debated. It could have been a physical ailment, psychological struggles from his concern over the churches, or his opponents who sought to persecute him. So it could have been one of those things. Who knows? Either way, this messenger of Satan was actually used by God as a way of refining Paul and keeping him in a way weak and humble. And with this weakness and humility, he is positioned to have power. The power of God rest on him. In the next few verses, Paul reveals the source of this power, of God's power, in the midst of his hardships and struggles. After he asked God 3 times to remove the thorn in his flesh, verses 9 and 10 state that God told him something. He said, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Then Paul says, "Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong." Wow, that's counterintuitive that Paul, along with us, can boast in our weaknesses. Most of the time we think of weakness as something to hide or downplay, be ashamed of, but God boasts in it. And he can be content and even glad, he says, in these weaknesses. Now, because of insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities, they draw out of us deep dependence and faith in God for strength. When you are strong in certain areas of your life, your flesh tends to rely on itself and what it can do, what we can do in our own power. But when we're weak, man, these weaknesses require us to rely on someone else. And his grace is sufficient. It is enough even through the darkest night. It's true, God's power is made perfect in our weaknesses. It requires us to give up our own will and desire and trust in God's power in a unique way because we're weak. In a desperate way, in a childlike way, we have to depend on him. Then his power is manifested in a great way. Now, while Paul is not freed up to speak about all these heavenly revelations that he mentions in this chapter, he instead focuses on the sufficiency of God's grace through his weaknesses and hardships. And that would be the platform. It would demonstrate the power of God. God's grace and strength in spite of weaknesses. That's his platform. And that is our platform today. God's strength in spite of our weaknesses. So are you enduring hardships this week? Insults, calamities? Do you have a thorn in your flesh like Paul? Remember, these are platforms for demonstrating the goodness and grace of God in your life. Now, how will you rely on his strength today? How will you show others that no matter what is happening in your life and how weak you may seem, that the power of Christ is resting on you? So let's walk humbly today, boasting in our weaknesses and shining a light on the strength found in the gospel. Remind yourself of the cross of Jesus Christ, the power of the resurrection, and that same power being sufficient no matter what happens in life. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.